I was folding laundry in our bedroom when the phone rang, and honestly, I almost didn't answer it. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of ordinary day where nothing interesting ever happens, or at least that's what I thought. But something made me pick up that phone, and I'm so grateful it did, because it changed everything. A woman's voice on the other end asked for Robert, my husband of 40 years, and when I told her he wasn't home, she hesitated for just a moment too long. I could feel it through the phone line, that strange pause that made my stomach drop. She said her name was Susan and that she needed to reach him urgently about their daughter's college tuition, and that's when my entire world went silent. I hung up the phone and sat on the edge of our bed, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might break through my chest. Our daughter? Robert and I had 2 children together, both grown and living their own lives, but we'd never discussed him having any other children. My hands were shaking as I set down the laundry basket, and I remember thinking how strange it was that my body knew something was terribly wrong before my mind could catch up. I replayed that woman's voice over and over in my head, trying to find some reasonable explanation, some innocent reason why a stranger would be calling my husband about a daughter I'd never heard of. That evening, I watched Robert come home from work just like he always did, kissing me on the cheek and asking what was for dinner, and I felt like I was looking at a completely different person. I didn't mention the phone call right away because I wanted to hear what he would say first, and when I finally asked him casually if anyone had called, he said no. Not that he knew of. The lie came so easily from his lips so naturally that I realized in that moment how little I might actually know about the man I'd spent the last 4 decades sleeping beside. I excused myself and went to the kitchen, pretending to check on the pot roast, but really I was trying to remember if there had been other strange phone calls, other moments that hadn't quite added up. Red flags that I'd ignored or rationalized away seemed to come flooding back to me now, like pieces of a puzzle I'd been too trusting to put together. That night, as Robert slept peacefully beside me, I lay awake in the darkness and made a decision that would either destroy our marriage or finally reveal the truth about the man I thought I knew so completely. I waited until Robert left for work the next morning, and then I did something I never thought I would do in 40 years of marriage. I went into his study, that sacred space where he kept his private papers and his computer, and I started looking through everything with shaking hands. I felt like a spy in my own home, like a criminal, but the hurt and anger driving me forward was stronger than any guilt I might feel about invading his privacy. His desk drawers were meticulous, organized just like everything else in his life, but in the back of the filing cabinet tucked behind old tax returns and insurance documents, I found a separate folder labeled Personal. My fingers trembled as I opened that folder and saw photographs I'd never seen before. There was Robert, looking exactly as he does now, standing with his arm around a woman who wasn't me, and there were children in those photographs too, smiling at the camera like they belonged to him completely. The dates on the back of the photos were shocking, going back nearly 30 years, which meant this hadn't been some recent affair or temporary lapse in judgment. This was a whole other life that he'd been living in parallel to ours, a secret family that he'd been maintaining and supporting for decades. I sank into his leather chair and felt the room spinning around me, wondering how many times he'd looked me in the eye and lied to me about where he was going. I photographed everything with my phone, my hands barely steady enough to hold the camera straight, because I knew I needed evidence of what I was finding. There were bank statements in that folder too, statements from accounts I'd never known existed, showing regular monthly transfers to an address in the neighboring county. The numbers were substantial, thousands of dollars every single month, money that must have come from accounts he kept secret from me, from our joint finances, from everything we'd built together. I realized then that I didn't just have a betrayal to confront. I had a financial deception of massive proportions that had been bleeding our family resources for nearly 3 decades. My phone buzzed with a text reminder about a dentist appointment I had that afternoon, and it felt surreal that the normal world was still turning, that the sun was still shining outside, that people were still going about their ordinary lives while mine was imploding. I carefully put everything back exactly as I'd found it, trying to steady my breathing and control the rage that was threatening to consume me entirely. As I closed the filing cabinet, I caught my reflection in the mirror above his desk, and I barely recognized the woman looking back at me. But there was something in her eyes that scared me more than anything else, because it was the look of someone who had just discovered she had nothing left to lose. That night, when Robert came home, I was sitting in the living room with a glass of wine, and I'd been waiting there for hours. I'd rehearsed what I was going to say 100 times, but when he walked through the door and saw me sitting there in the dark with just one lamp on, he knew something was wrong. I didn't yell, I didn't cry, I didn't throw anything, which is probably what surprised him most, because I think he was expecting a scene. Instead, I calmly asked him about his daughter named Sarah, and watched his face go absolutely white, watched the color drain from his cheeks as he realized that his secret was no longer secret. He tried to lie at first, claimed he didn't know what I was talking about, but when I pulled out the photographs I'd printed and laid them on the coffee table between us, he sat down heavily on the couch, like his legs had simply given up. I watched him struggle for words, watched him try to construct some kind of explanation that would make sense of the incomprehensible, and finally he just put his head in his hands and didn't speak at all. I asked him how long this had been going on, how many other children he had, whether this woman was someone he loved, whether our entire marriage had been a lie. The questions poured out of me like water from a broken dam, and he couldn't seem to answer a single one of them. What came next was the part that broke me most of all. Robert looked up at me with tears in his eyes and said he didn't know how to explain it, that he'd made a terrible mistake when he was young and stupid, and that he'd been trying to fix it ever since by maintaining both lives. He said he'd never meant to hurt me, that he loved me, that he didn't know how to leave one life without destroying the other. I listened to his excuses and his regrets and his explanations, and I realized that none of it mattered because the damage was already done. The man I thought I'd married, the man I'd trusted with my entire adult life, had been living a lie so elaborate that it had required decades of careful planning and constant deception. I told him to leave, to get out of my house and go stay with his other family if they meant so much to him. And I watched the shock register on his face as he realized that I wasn't going to forgive him with a hug and a promise to work through it. He tried to argue, tried to say we could fix this, but I was already walking up the stairs to our bedroom, already beginning to imagine a life without him in it. As I closed the bedroom door behind me and locked it, I heard him downstairs making phone calls, and I wondered which family he was calling first, which life he was going to choose now that both of them were falling apart. Over the next few days, as Robert moved through the house in silence, packing his belongings and sleeping in the guest room, I did something I probably shouldn't have done. I hired a private investigator, something I'd seen in movies but never thought I'd actually do in real life. I needed to understand the full extent of what had been happening, needed to know exactly who this other woman was and who these children were that my husband had been supporting all these years. The investigator's report came back within 2 weeks, and what I learned made me understand that Robert's betrayal was even more calculated and cruel than I'd originally thought. The woman's name was Margaret, and she'd been Robert's girlfriend for 31 years, which meant he'd started this affair just 7 years into our marriage. They had 3 children together, 2 daughters and a son, all of whom Robert had legally acknowledged and listed on birth certificates and school records. He'd been paying for their housing, their education, their lives in full, while simultaneously maintaining his marriage to me and our family. Margaret lived in a nice house just 30 miles away, close enough that he could visit regularly, but far enough that there was little chance of us accidentally running into each other at the grocery store or the mall. What struck me most was that Margaret apparently knew about me. According to the investigator's report, Robert had told her that we had an open marriage, that we'd agreed to this arrangement years ago, that I was fine with him having another family. The lies were layered upon lies, each one building on the previous one, creating this entire false narrative that had allowed him to justify his actions to himself and to her. The investigator included photographs, bank records, and detailed timelines that showed exactly how often Robert had been visiting Margaret's house, how much money he'd been spending on her and their children. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. I sat at my kitchen table with the investigator's file spread out in front of me and realized that I couldn't just leave this situation as it was. This wasn't just about my marriage or my hurt feelings anymore. This was about protecting myself financially and legally. Because if Margaret or their children ever found out the truth about Robert's deception to them, they might have legal claims on our assets. I called my lawyer and began the process of filing for divorce, listing all of the investigator's findings as evidence of financial infidelity and emotional abuse. Robert tried to argue, tried to negotiate, tried to convince me to keep everything quiet, but I was done listening to his pleas. The divorce proceedings moved forward, and Robert's lawyer tried to get him out of revealing the full extent of his financial deception. But the judge wasn't having it. During our court appearance, when the judge asked Robert to explain the separate bank accounts and the regular monthly transfers, he had to admit to everything right there in the courtroom. He had to explain about Margaret and the children, had to explain why he'd been hiding money from his marital assets, had to explain how he'd been living this double life for 3 decades. The look on his face when the judge ordered him to disclose all of his accounts and all of his assets was the moment I realized this situation was about to get so much worse before it could possibly get better. But here's what I didn't expect and what changed everything about my understanding of what had been happening. Robert's lawyer requested that I be informed that Margaret was now aware of the truth, aware that Robert had lied to her about the nature of our marriage and about his intentions toward his relationship with her and their children. Apparently she'd found out through mutual friends, and she was furious in a way that I recognized because I felt the exact same anger myself. For the first time since this nightmare began, I realized that I wasn't alone in my betrayal, that there was another woman who had been deceived just as thoroughly as I had been, and that realization opened up an entirely new possibility that I'd never considered. I made the decision to reach out to Margaret, and honestly, I wasn't even sure if she would agree to meet with me. When I finally got her phone number from the investigator and called her, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. She answered on the second ring, and before I could lose my nerve, I said, "I think we should talk. I think we have a lot to discuss, and I don't think either of us deserves to be alone right now." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and then I heard her take a breath and say, "I was hoping you would call. I have something you need to know, and it's going to change everything." When Margaret and I finally met in person, I wasn't sure what to expect. I'd imagined this moment 1,000 different ways, sometimes thinking I'd want to confront her, blame her, make her understand the pain she'd caused me. But when I saw her sitting across from me in that coffee shop, I realized we were both victims of the same deception. She was an attractive woman, probably around my age, with kind eyes that were red from crying, and when she reached across the table and took my hand, I felt something shift inside me. She didn't say "I'm sorry" or try to excuse herself. Instead, she said, "He lied to both of us, and I think we need to figure out exactly how deep those lies go, because there's something else you need to know about your husband." Margaret told me that Robert had been telling her for years that he was planning to leave me, that he promised her they would eventually get married, that our marriage was already over in everything but name. He'd been making promises to her that contradicted every promise he'd made to me, creating 2 separate realities that couldn't possibly coexist. But the part that made my blood run cold was when she told me that Robert had recently taken out a substantial life insurance policy on himself, one that listed her children as beneficiaries instead of our own children. He'd been planning something, she said, some kind of exit strategy that would have left her and their kids secure while potentially leaving me with nothing. I felt the color drain from my face as I listened to Margaret describe conversations she'd had with Robert about his will. Conversations where he'd mentioned wanting to make sure his real family was taken care of. The implication was clear and terrifying that Robert had been planning to somehow disappear from my life completely, probably by faking his own death, or creating some legal fiction that would allow him to abandon our marriage while securing Margaret's future. We sat there in that coffee shop, two women who should have been enemies, realizing that we were both pieces in a much larger, much darker game that Robert had been playing with both of our lives. Margaret pulled out her phone and showed me text messages between her and Robert, messages where he'd been discussing money, discussing moving away, discussing how he could make the transition from one life to another without anyone getting hurt. The dates on those messages went back months, which meant he'd been planning this while sitting across from me at dinner, while sleeping in my bed, while holding my hand. I realized that the confrontation I'd orchestrated, the discovery I'd made, had actually interrupted something much more sinister than just a simple affair. I'd accidentally stopped him from executing whatever plan he'd been carefully constructing. Margaret said to me, "I think we need to talk to a lawyer together, because if he's been hiding money and planning something this elaborate, there's probably a lot more we don't know about yet." I agreed, and for the first time since this nightmare had begun, I felt like I had an ally instead of an adversary. As we were leaving the coffee shop, Margaret stopped and looked back at me with an expression that was both sad and determined, and she said something that made my stomach drop. "There's one more thing," she said quietly. "Robert has a third family, another woman, another set of kids. I only found out about her when I started investigating after I learned about you." The shock of learning that there was a third family was almost more than I could process. I'd spent the last week coming to terms with the betrayal of one secret family, and now I was being told that Robert had somehow managed to maintain not 2 but 3 parallel lives. I called my lawyer immediately and explained the situation, and I could hear the incredulous tone in her voice as she listened to what I was describing. She said, "In 30 years of practicing family law, I have never heard of anything like this. This isn't just infidelity, this is orchestrated, systematic deception on a scale that suggests serious psychological pathology." We decided to hire the same investigator again, but this time with a specific focus on uncovering all of Robert's financial accounts, all of his hidden assets, and any other family arrangements he might have hidden from us. The investigator came back with a report that was almost comical in its scope, except there was nothing funny about it. Robert had been maintaining 3 separate households, 3 separate bank accounts, and 3 separate sets of lies with such precision that it seemed almost impossible that he hadn't made a mistake sooner. He'd been taking out different cell phones for different relationships, scheduling his time with military precision, and creating elaborate cover stories to explain his absences to each family. The third woman, Patricia, apparently knew about Margaret but had been told that Margaret was a past relationship that Robert still felt obligated to help financially. Patricia thought that Margaret's children were from a previous marriage and that Robert was just being a good person by helping support them. Neither Margaret nor Patricia knew about me, or if they did, they believed the same story that Robert had told them, that I was part of some arrangement we'd all agreed to. The investigator's report included financial documents showing that Robert had been spending roughly equal amounts of money on each household, which meant he'd been living on a scale that would have required a significant income to maintain. When I looked at the numbers, I realized that Robert must have inherited money from his parents years ago, money he'd never told me about, money that had been funding these other relationships the entire time. My hands shook as I calculated how much money we were talking about, how much of our joint assets and his hidden inheritance had been spent on maintaining these other lives. Margaret and I met again, this time with Patricia joining us, and I'll never forget the look on Patricia's face when she realized that everything Robert had told her was a lie. She actually vomited in the parking lot before we even made it inside the restaurant where we'd planned to meet. The 3 of us sat together and compared notes, compared the lies we'd each been told, compared the promises Robert had made to each of us about the future. Patricia revealed that Robert had proposed to her 2 years ago, had bought her an engagement ring, and made plans for a wedding that he'd said would happen once his current obligations were resolved. When she realized that his current obligations were 2 wives and 3 families, she started crying in a way that broke my heart even in the midst of my own pain. In that moment, as I watched 2 other women grapple with the same devastation I'd been experiencing, I realized that Robert's betrayal had created a ripple effect of destruction that extended far beyond just the 3 of us. What happened next was almost surgical in its precision. Margaret, Patricia, and I hired the same lawyer together, and we presented Robert with a unified front that he couldn't manipulate or divide. We had evidence of every lie, every hidden account, every fraudulent promise he'd made. We knew about the life insurance policies, the hidden inheritance, the systematic deception that had characterized our entire relationships with him. When Robert realized that all 3 of us were working together, that we'd shared information and compared notes, I watched something break inside him that I didn't think could be fixed. His lawyer tried to negotiate, tried to argue that he should be allowed to keep some privacy regarding his financial arrangements, but the judge was having none of it. The court ordered a complete financial disclosure, which revealed that Robert had been using money from a trust left to him by his parents to fund all 3 families. The inheritance was substantial, in the neighborhood of $2 million, and he'd been depleting it at a rate that suggested he'd planned to have it all spent within the next 15 years. The judge ordered that what remained of that inheritance be divided equally among all 3 families, with the lion's share going to me as his legal wife of 40 years. The divorce settlement was swift and brutal. I was granted the house, half of his remaining assets, and alimony payments that would support me comfortably for the rest of my life. Margaret and Patricia each received settlements as well, though technically Robert wasn't legally married to them, which complicated their claims significantly, but the lawyer argued that they'd been defrauded, that they'd made life decisions based on Robert's lies, and the judge agreed to award them substantial sums as compensation for his systematic deception. Robert ended up with very little, a small apartment, and a monthly income that was a fraction of what he'd been earning before. But what really devastated Robert, more than the financial loss, was losing custody rights to the children from his other 2 families. The courts determined that his pattern of deception and his inability to maintain stable, honest relationships made him a potential danger to the children's well-being. Margaret's children, who were now adults, wanted nothing to do with him anyway, but Patricia's younger children, who were still teenagers, were heartbroken and angry. Robert tried to fight the custody restrictions, but the judge was unmoved by his pleas, and in the end he lost the right to see those kids without court-supervised visitation. I sat in that courtroom and watched the man I'd spent 40 years with be systematically stripped of everything he'd built through lies and deception, and I felt very little satisfaction. I thought I would feel triumphant, vindicated, powerful, but instead I just felt tired and sad. This man had wasted decades of my life, had stolen from me emotionally and financially, had hurt so many people in pursuit of some fantasy where he could be everything to everyone and still maintain some sense of respectability. As the judge banged the gavel and finalized the divorce, I realized that this wasn't the ending I thought I wanted, because no ending could truly make up for the years I'd lost. The weeks following the final divorce hearing were strange and disorienting. I had the house, I had financial security, I had won in the legal sense, but I had also lost 40 years of my life to a man who'd never truly been honest with me for a single day of our marriage. My children were struggling to process what had happened to their father, struggling to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the man he revealed himself to be. They were angry at him, but they were also grieving, because you can't spend your whole life with someone without loving them, and love doesn't just disappear when you discover they've been lying to you. My daughter called me one evening and asked a question that I hadn't let myself think about until that moment. She said, "Mom, did you ever wonder if maybe you didn't want to know the truth? Like maybe on some level you knew something was wrong, but you decided not to look too closely because the alternative was too scary?" Her words hit me like a punch, because I realized she was right. There had been strange moments over the years, times when Robert's explanations didn't quite add up, times when he seemed distracted or evasive, times when I'd chosen to ignore my instincts because asking questions would mean upending everything I'd built my adult life around. I started seeing a therapist, something I probably should have done years ago, and I began the long process of untangling what was real in my marriage and what had been illusion. The therapist helped me understand that I wasn't stupid for not seeing the signs, that people who are deeply embedded in relationships often can't see the red flags that would be obvious to an outsider. She helped me forgive myself for the time I'd wasted, for the love I'd given to someone who didn't deserve it, for the loyalty I'd shown to someone who'd shown me none in return. But forgiveness, I learned, doesn't mean forgetting, and it doesn't mean that the pain just goes away. Margaret and I remained in contact, and we became an unlikely pair of friends united by our shared experience of betrayal. We'd meet for lunch sometimes and talk about our lives, about how we were rebuilding, about what we'd learned from this whole nightmare. Patricia eventually moved away to start fresh somewhere new, and I respected her need to distance herself from everything that reminded her of Robert. But Margaret stayed in town, stayed in the county, and we became part of each other's healing process in a way I never could have predicted. One day, months into my recovery, Margaret said something to me that made me laugh for the first time since this all began. She said, "You know what the craziest part of this whole thing is? Robert actually thought he could get away with this forever. Like he thought there would never be a phone call that came at the wrong time, never be a mistake that would unravel everything. Men like that, they think they're so smart, so clever, but they always mess up eventually because you can't maintain that level of deception without eventually forgetting which lie goes with which person." And as I sat there listening to her, I realized that this experience, as terrible as it had been, had taught me something valuable about human nature and about my own strength. But then Margaret's expression changed, became serious, and she said, "There's something else I need to tell you, something about Robert that might explain why he did all of this in the first place." Margaret had done some additional investigating on her own, hiring her own private investigator to look into Robert's past, and what she'd uncovered suggested that Robert's need to maintain multiple relationships might not have been about love or desire at all, but about something much darker. The investigator had discovered that Robert's childhood was deeply traumatic, that his father had abandoned the family when Robert was young, and that his mother had been a series of different men in and out of their lives. The investigator had concluded that Robert had unconsciously been recreating his mother's behavior, seeking out multiple relationships because his early childhood experiences had left him unable to believe that any one person could truly stay with him. But there was more, and this is where things got genuinely disturbing. Margaret showed me records from a psychologist that Robert had apparently visited in his 20s, and in the notes, the therapist had written observations about Robert's patterns of narcissism and his apparent inability to form authentic emotional connections. The therapist had noted that Robert seemed to view relationships as transactions, as ways of proving his worth and his power over others, rather than as genuine human connections based on mutual respect and love. The note suggested that Robert's need to maintain multiple families might escalate over time, that his compulsive need to control and deceive might eventually lead to more serious psychological breakdown. I felt a chill run down my spine as I read those psychological notes because it meant that Robert's behavior wasn't something that had come out of nowhere. It was a pattern, a deeply rooted psychological issue that had probably been developing since his childhood. That didn't excuse what he'd done. It didn't make the pain any less real. But it did help me understand that I wasn't actually in love with a man named Robert. I was in love with an illusion that Robert had carefully crafted. The real Robert, the man beneath all the lies, was someone I'd never actually known at all. Margaret said to me, "I found out something else too, and I'm telling you this because you deserve to know exactly who this man is that you were married to." She pulled out another document, this one from a different investigator, and showed me that Robert had apparently attempted suicide shortly after his father had abandoned the family when he was 12 years old. His mother had found him and gotten him help, but the incident had clearly left deep scars. He'd spent years in and out of therapy, years struggling with depression and what appeared to be borderline personality disorder, the kind of condition that would make someone unable to maintain stable relationships. As I sat there reading through all of this information about my ex-husband's psychological history, I felt a strange mixture of emotions that I couldn't quite untangle. There was still anger, still hurt, still betrayal, but there was also a kind of sad understanding that Robert was deeply broken, that his actions weren't about me or anything I had or hadn't done. They were about his own internal chaos and his inability to manage his own psychological damage. That realization didn't fix anything. It didn't give me back the 40 years I'd lost, but it did help me let go of the shame I'd been carrying, the secret fear that somehow I was responsible for his behavior, that if I'd been a better wife or more attentive or more understanding, maybe he wouldn't have felt the need to build these other lives. But then Margaret said something that made me realize this story was far from over. "There's one more thing," she said quietly, and her voice had taken on a tone that made my heart start racing again. "Robert contacted me last week. He's asking to meet with you, and he says he has something important to tell you about why he did all of this. He says there's something about your marriage that you don't know, something that might change how you understand everything that happened." I felt my hands start to tremble, because after all of this, after all of the lies and the betrayal and the destruction, I wasn't sure if I had it in me to hear whatever revelation Robert was about to drop on me. I didn't want to meet with Robert, but Margaret convinced me that I needed to hear whatever he had to say, that closure required understanding, and that running from this final conversation would leave me with unanswered questions for the rest of my life. So I agreed to meet him at a neutral location, a small coffee shop across town where we were unlikely to run into anyone we knew, and I brought Margaret with me for support, even though Robert didn't know she was coming. When he arrived and saw her sitting across from me at that small corner table, his face went pale, and I could see him calculating whether this meeting was still worth having or if he should just turn around and walk back out the door. But Robert sat down, and for the first time since this entire nightmare had begun, he looked like the man I thought I knew, broken and defeated and finally willing to be honest about something. He told me that he needed to apologize, not just for the affairs or the money or the lies, but for something much more fundamental, something that went to the very heart of why he'd done all of this in the first place. He said, "I need you to know that I never loved any of them the way I loved you. And that's the problem. I loved you too much, and it terrified me. So I created other lives where I could control the love, where I could decide how much to give and how much to take away." Robert explained that when we first got married, he'd been so overwhelmed by the depth of his feelings for me that it had scared him, that he'd felt like he was losing control of himself. He said that his fear of abandonment, rooted in his father's departure from his childhood home, had made it impossible for him to trust that I would stay with him if he was just himself, if he was broken and damaged and struggling. So instead of trying to fix himself or get help, he'd created a situation where he had leverage, where he had other families who needed him financially, where he could convince himself that he was too important to anyone to be left behind. I listened to Robert's explanation, and while some part of me wanted to rage at him, to tell him that his psychological issues didn't excuse his cruelty, I also recognized that he was finally being honest with me, in a way he'd never been before. He continued saying that over the years, the lie had become so consuming that he'd almost forgotten it was a lie, that he'd convinced himself that maintaining all three families was actually a form of love, that he was taking care of everyone and making them all happy. But deep down, he'd always known that it was going to fall apart eventually, that no one could maintain that level of deception forever without eventually making a catastrophic mistake. Margaret suddenly spoke up, and her voice was sharp and cutting. She said, "Robert, you don't get to come in here and make this about your pain, about your childhood trauma, about your fear of abandonment. You had choices. You could have gotten therapy. You could have talked to your wife. You could have faced your fears like an adult instead of destroying the lives of 3 women and 6 children because you were too much of a coward to deal with your own psychological damage. And Robert didn't argue with her, didn't try to defend himself or make excuses. He just nodded and said, "You're right. You're absolutely right, and there's no excuse for what I've done." Then Robert looked directly at me, and he said something that I didn't expect and couldn't have prepared for. "There's something else, something that I discovered during my own therapy after all of this came out, something that I think you deserve to know, because it might explain something about why you didn't see the signs, why you trusted me so completely for all those years." He paused, and the weight of whatever he was about to say seemed to physically press down on him. "I think that you might have known, on some level, that something was wrong, but I think I manipulated you so thoroughly that I convinced you to ignore your own instincts. I think I made you doubt yourself so consistently that you stopped trusting your own perception of reality." Robert's words hit me like a physical blow, because as he was saying them, I began to remember moments throughout our 40-year marriage that I'd dismissed or rationalized, moments where I'd questioned my own sanity and my own judgment. He'd done this systematically, I realized. Whenever I'd asked him about his schedule or his whereabouts or anything that seemed even slightly out of the ordinary, he would get frustrated with me, would tell me I was being paranoid, would suggest that maybe I was becoming too anxious or too controlling. He'd made me feel like my concerns were unfounded, like my doubts were evidence of my own psychological problems, rather than legitimate questions about his behavior. I remembered a specific incident from about 15 years ago when I'd found a hotel receipt in his jacket pocket, a receipt for a hotel stay that he'd never mentioned to me. When I'd confronted him about it, he'd told me that I must have made a mistake, that I'd probably found it somewhere else and didn't remember correctly. He'd suggested that maybe my memory was getting fuzzy, that maybe I was becoming forgetful, and he'd made me doubt what I'd literally held in my own hands. He'd convinced me to throw away the receipt, told me I was being ridiculous and paranoid, and I'd actually apologized to him for accusing him of something he'd never done, or so I thought at the time. Robert continued, "I learned this from my mother, actually. She would lie to me about basic facts of my childhood, and when I'd contradict her based on my own memories, she'd convince me that I was misremembering, that I was confused, that I was making things up. By the time I was an adult, I had no idea what was real and what wasn't in my own mind, so I just started accepting whatever version of reality people presented to me. And then I realized I could use that same technique on other people, that if I was confident enough and consistent enough in my lies, people would actually start to doubt themselves instead of doubting me." I felt tears starting to stream down my face as I listened to Robert describe the systematic way he'd manipulated my perception of reality, the calculated effort he'd put into making me question my own sanity and my own judgment. Margaret reached over and squeezed my hand, and I could see her own eyes glistening with tears as she realized that he'd probably done the same thing to her, that we'd all been victims of the same psychological manipulation. Robert said, "I'm not telling you this to make excuses or to get you to feel sorry for me. I'm telling you this because you deserve to understand that none of this was about your failure as a wife or your failure to see the signs. I made sure you couldn't see the signs. I deliberately and systematically made it impossible for you to trust your own perception of reality." The horror of that realization settled over me like a heavy blanket, because it meant that I wasn't just grieving a marriage that had turned out to be built on lies. I was grieving the loss of my own sense of reality and my own mental clarity. I'd spent 40 years second-guessing myself, dismissing my own instincts, accepting Robert's version of events over my own observations, and it had all been part of his deliberate strategy to keep me from discovering the truth. I looked at Robert and said, "Why would you tell me this now? Why would you confess to deliberately gaslighting me when you could have just let me believe that I was somehow complicit in my own blindness?" Robert's answer was simple and heartbreaking. He said, "Because I've spent the last 6 months in therapy with a therapist who specializes in personality disorders, and she's helped me understand that what I've done to all of you is unforgivable, that no amount of explaining or justifying my behavior can undo the damage. And because I think you deserve to know that you weren't crazy, that your instincts were actually correct, that there was something fundamentally wrong with what was happening in our marriage, and you're not insane for not seeing it, because I was deliberately hiding it from you in ways that would make it impossible for anyone to see. But then he said something that changed the entire tenor of the conversation, something that made me realize that even now, even after all of this, Robert was still hiding something from me. He said, "There's one more thing that my therapist thinks I should tell you, something that might be important for your own healing and for understanding the full scope of what happened between us. But before I tell you, I need to know if you really want to hear it, because once I say it out loud, it can't be unsaid, and it's going to hurt in ways that might be worse than anything you've already experienced." I told Robert to tell me whatever he needed to tell me, that at this point nothing could possibly shock me more than what I'd already learned, and I was wrong. I was very, very wrong. And the moment I gave him permission to speak, I could see him struggling with how to form the words, struggling with how to say something that was clearly causing him tremendous internal pain. He took a deep breath and said, "I didn't just start the affair with Margaret because of my own psychological issues. There was something that happened in our marriage that made me feel like you didn't actually love me. And when Margaret came along, she made me feel like I could be loved the way I needed to be loved." I asked him what he meant, what had happened in our marriage that could have made him feel that way, and he told me a story that I'd completely forgotten about. Or maybe I'd repressed it because it had been so painful at the time. He said that early in our marriage, when I was pregnant with our first child, I'd expressed doubts about whether I'd made the right choice, whether I was ready to be a mother, whether I'd wanted to marry him, or if I'd only done it because I was pregnant. He said, "You told me that if you could go back in time, you might not have married me, that you felt trapped, and that you resented me for the life that you felt like I'd forced you into." I did remember that conversation, remembered being terrified and overwhelmed and expressing fears that I'd thought we'd moved past years ago. But Robert had been carrying that wound with him for decades, had let it fester and grow into this consuming need to prove that someone out there loved him more than I did, that someone appreciated him more than I ever could. He'd created these other lives not just out of his own psychological pathology, but also out of a need to escape from a marriage that he felt had been built on my resentment and my sense of being trapped. And even though I'd tried to apologize for those words in the years that followed, even though I'd tried to show him through my actions that I loved him deeply, he'd never been able to truly forgive me or truly believe me. I felt something shift inside me as I listened to him talk about how much pain he'd been in, how much he'd been struggling with those old wounds, and I realized that this had been a toxic cycle that both of us had been trapped in. I'd said those things out of fear and insecurity, and he'd responded by building an elaborate lie to protect himself from the emotional pain that he believed I'd caused him. Neither of us had been completely innocent in this tragedy, and neither of us had been completely guilty either. We both made mistakes, both caused each other pain, both failed to communicate about what was really hurting us. But then Robert said something that made me realize that understanding his motivation didn't absolve him of responsibility for his actions. He said, "I know that doesn't excuse what I did. I know that carrying that pain doesn't give me the right to hurt you, to hurt Margaret, to hurt Patricia, to hurt our children. I know that instead of dealing with my own wounds, I inflicted new wounds on everyone around me. I'm just telling you this so that you understand that this wasn't actually about you or your failure as a wife. This was about my inability to process my own pain and my own fears, and I'm deeply sorry for that." I sat there across from my ex-husband of 40 years and realized that I could feel compassion for him without forgiving him, that I could understand his pain without excusing his behavior, that I could acknowledge his humanity without absolving him of responsibility. But as I was processing all of this, Margaret suddenly stood up from her chair and her face had gone completely white. She said, "Robert, when you say that you created these other families to escape from pain, did you ever consider that you might have hurt us even more by refusing to be honest about what was happening? Did you ever think about what it would do to us to find out that we were part of some elaborate fantasy that you created to deal with your own issues?" Robert didn't have an answer, and his silence was deafening. Margaret continued, her voice shaking with emotion. You made a choice every single day for 31 years to lie to me, to manipulate me, to keep me in a situation where I was an unwitting participant in your psychological recovery project. And you made that choice not because you had to, not because you were sick, but because it was easier than actually facing your pain and dealing with it like an adult. As she was speaking, my phone buzzed with a text message, and when I looked at it, my blood ran cold. The message was from my lawyer, and it said, "Robert's been arrested. Police found evidence that he's been planning something. Call me immediately." I looked up from my phone and stared at Robert, trying to understand what this could possibly mean, trying to process what new revelation was about to destroy what remained of my understanding of the man I'd spent 40 years married to. The coffee shop suddenly felt like it was closing in on me, and I could barely breathe as I read my lawyer's message over and over again, trying to make sense of what it could mean. Robert had been arrested, but arrested for what? The divorce was finalized, the settlement had been made. What could he possibly have done that would bring the police into this situation? I looked at Robert sitting across from me, and he suddenly looked confused, like he didn't understand what had just happened. He said, "What's going on? What did your lawyer say?" I told him that I'd just received a message saying he'd been arrested, and I watched the color drain completely from his face. He immediately pulled out his phone and saw that he had multiple missed calls from his own lawyer, and he called her back with shaking hands. The conversation was brief, and when he hung up, he looked like he was going to be sick. He said, "The police found something in my apartment, something that I thought I'd destroyed years ago, something that they're saying proves I was planning to do something terrible." Margaret and I exchanged a look of confusion and fear, and I asked Robert what he was talking about, what the police had found, what he'd been planning. He told us that he needed to go to the police station immediately, that his lawyer was meeting him there, and that he couldn't discuss it with us. He stood up to leave, and I grabbed his arm and said, "Robert, you need to tell us what this is about right now. You owe us that much after everything else you've done." Robert sat back down slowly, and he told us a story that made the horror of this situation even worse than I could have imagined. He said that years ago, when he'd first started the affair with Margaret, he'd been so consumed with guilt and fear that he'd written a detailed plan for how he could end his life in a way that would make it look like an accident. He'd taken out the life insurance policies as a way to make sure that Margaret and their children would be taken care of after he was gone. He'd been planning to kill himself, he said, but he'd never actually gone through with it because he was too much of a coward, even for that. But he'd kept those plans, had kept the detailed notes about how and when he would do it, and the police had found them during a search of his apartment that had been authorized as part of the criminal investigation into his financial crimes. Apparently, someone had reported him to the authorities for suspicion of insurance fraud, and when the police had executed the search warrant, they discovered these detailed plans for his own suicide, along with documentation about the life insurance policies. The police had taken it seriously, had arrested him on suspicion of planning to commit insurance fraud by staging his own death, and now he was facing criminal charges in addition to everything else. I felt Margaret grab my hand under the table, and I could feel her shaking as badly as I was shaking. We'd both been so focused on understanding Robert's psychological motivations and his patterns of deception that neither of us had considered that he might be actively suicidal, that his entire elaborate system of maintaining multiple families might have been some kind of unconscious death wish that had manifested in financial and emotional abuse rather than in direct self-harm. Robert said, "My lawyer says that the prosecutor is arguing that the life insurance policies and the planning documents prove that I was committing insurance fraud, that I was deliberately planning to fake my own death to collect the insurance money and set up Margaret and the children with money they didn't deserve." But Robert insisted that that wasn't true, that he'd never actually planned to go through with the insurance fraud, that the life insurance policies had been taken out in a moment of desperation and suicidal ideation, but that he'd eventually decided to live to try to work through his issues, to actually be present for the people in his life. The problem was that he had no evidence of that decision, no timeline that showed when he'd stopped planning his suicide, nothing that would prove to a court that he'd abandoned his original plan. His detailed notes showed someone who was deeply disturbed, someone who'd been planning his own death with meticulous detail, and the life insurance policies looked like the actions of someone committing fraud. As I sat there listening to Robert explain his legal problems, I realized that this entire situation had spiraled so far beyond what I could have ever anticipated that I almost couldn't process it anymore. This man had lied to me for 40 years. He'd destroyed 3 families, he'd manipulated and gaslit me into doubting my own reality, and now it turned out that he'd also been actively planning his own suicide while maintaining these elaborate other lives. I asked him, "Did any of us know you at all? Did any of us ever actually know the real Robert? Or was everything that we thought we knew about you just another layer of the lie?" Robert couldn't answer my question, and his inability to respond was perhaps the most honest thing he'd done in this entire situation. His silence was an admission that even he didn't know who the real Robert was anymore, that the lies had become so consuming, the different versions of himself that he'd created so elaborate that he'd lost track of what was actually real about him and what was just another performance. I realized in that moment that Robert wasn't evil. He wasn't even really a conscious deceiver in the traditional sense. He was deeply, profoundly broken, and he'd spent his entire adult life building an increasingly complex structure of lies to avoid dealing with the fundamental brokenness at his core. Margaret stood up and told Robert that she needed to leave, that she couldn't sit in that coffee shop anymore, and process the fact that the man she'd spent 31 years loving had been planning his own suicide the entire time. She said, "I could understand the affairs. I could even understand the manipulation and the deception, but I can't understand knowing that you were planning to abandon us, to leave us with insurance money as some kind of twisted way of staying in our lives, even after you were dead. You were going to take your own life and leave us with the guilt in the insurance payout and the knowledge that we somehow drove you to that decision." The pain in Margaret's voice was so raw and so honest that I felt my own heart breaking even further, because even after everything Robert had done to her, she still cared enough to grieve the fact that he'd been suffering that much. She left the coffee shop without waiting for a response, and I was left alone with Robert, the man who'd been my husband for 40 years, the man who'd built his entire existence on lies, the man who'd nearly taken his own life while simultaneously building these elaborate fantasies about other families. I asked Robert one more question before I left that coffee shop, one final question that I needed answered. I said, "If the police hadn't found those documents, if they hadn't arrested you, would you have continued seeing me? Would you have continued to act like you were genuinely apologizing and genuinely trying to make amends, all while you were secretly planning to end your life and leave all of us with the wreckage of your suicide?" And Robert looked at me with such profound sadness in his eyes that I almost couldn't bear it. And he said, "I honestly don't know. I don't know if I would have had the courage to actually go through with it. And I don't know if I would have eventually told you the truth or if I would have died still lying to you." As I was leaving the coffee shop, walking away from Robert for what I hoped would be the last time, I realized that the story I thought was ending was actually just beginning to unravel in new and even more disturbing ways. The police investigation was going to continue. The criminal charges were going to move forward, and eventually some court would have to determine whether Robert was guilty of insurance fraud or whether he was simply a deeply disturbed man who'd made poor choices and documented them in ways that looked criminal. But more importantly, I realized that Margaret and Patricia and I were going to have to process not just his betrayals, but also the knowledge that he'd been actively suicidal throughout our entire relationships with him. I drove home in a daze, and when I got there, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat in my kitchen, the kitchen where Robert and I had shared thousands of meals over 40 years, and I tried to make sense of what my life had been. Had any of it been real? Had I ever known the man I'd married, or had I always been married to a carefully constructed illusion? And perhaps most importantly, could I ever trust my own judgment about people again? Or had Robert's decades of gaslighting and manipulation damaged my ability to perceive reality in ways that I might never recover from? As I sat there in the silence of my empty house, my phone rang, and it was my lawyer again. She said, "You need to come to the police station. They want to talk to you about Robert's plans. There's something else you need to know." I arrived at the police station within 20 minutes, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles had turned white. My lawyer met me in the lobby and walked me back to an interrogation room where 2 detectives were waiting, and the moment I sat down across from them, I could feel the weight of whatever they were about to tell me pressing down on my chest. The lead detective, a woman named Detective Morrison with sharp eyes and an expression of professional concern, slid a folder across the table toward me and said, "Mrs. Patterson, we need to ask you some questions about your husband's activities over the past several months, and we need to know if you were aware of anything unusual in his behavior." I told her that I hadn't been aware of anything because I'd been in the process of divorcing Robert, that I'd discovered his affairs and his double life, and that I'd been focused on the legal proceedings rather than on monitoring his activities. Detective Morrison opened the folder and showed me photographs of surveillance equipment that had been found in Robert's apartment, and my stomach dropped as I realized what I was looking at. There were cameras, recording devices, and documentation of what appeared to be systematic surveillance of multiple locations. She said, "Your husband has been photographing and recording people without their consent. We found footage of women in private moments, documentation that suggests he's been engaged in voyeurism and potentially stalking behavior." The room started to spin around me, and I had to grip the edge of the table to keep myself from falling out of my chair. My lawyer put a hand on my shoulder, and I could hear him saying something to the detective about making sure this wasn't going to implicate me in any way. But I could barely focus on what was being said. Detective Morrison continued, "We found evidence that he's been recording Margaret without her knowledge, recording you without your knowledge, and recording Patricia as well. He's also been recording his own children from both families in private moments, in bathrooms, in bedrooms, documentation that suggests he was engaged in behavior that we would classify as criminal voyeurism and harassment." I felt bile rising in my throat as I realized that Robert had been documenting our lives in ways that I'd never suspected, that he'd been watching us, recording us, preserving footage of us in moments where we believed we were in complete privacy. The violation of that was so profound, so complete, that I couldn't even formulate words to express how I felt. I asked the detective why he would do something like that, what possible motivation could drive someone to engage in that kind of behavior. And she said based on what we found in his apartment, it appears that he was creating some kind of record, a documentation of everyone in his life. We found journals that suggest he was obsessed with controlling the narrative of his own life, with having proof of his version of events, with being able to show people later what they'd done or said. Detective Morrison pulled out a series of journal entries that had been photographed and printed out, and she read passages to me that made my skin crawl. Robert had written things like, "She didn't realize I was watching her. She looked so peaceful in that moment, completely unaware of me. That's the only time I feel safe around people, when they don't know I'm there. That's the only time I can be completely myself without having to perform or lie or pretend." Another entry read, "I have proof now. I have evidence of everything they did, everything they said, every moment they thought they were alone. If they ever challenge my version of events, I can show them what really happened. I can show them that I was right all along." The horror of what Robert had done slowly settled over me like a suffocating blanket, because I realized that the surveillance and the recording had probably been part of his larger system of control, part of his need to maintain power over everyone in his life. He wasn't just lying to us, he was watching us, documenting us, trying to gather evidence against us that he could use to prove that his version of reality was the correct one. I asked Detective Morrison if this meant that he'd been gaslighting me with the same recordings, if he'd been using footage of me doing things I'd forgotten about as evidence to prove that my own memory was unreliable. She said, "That's a strong possibility, yes. We found multiple instances where he'd recorded conversations or moments and then claimed later that they'd happened differently, or that you'd misremembered what had occurred. It appears he was using this technology as part of a larger pattern of psychological manipulation and control." My lawyer immediately started taking notes and muttering about civil suits and invasion of privacy and all of the legal ramifications of what Robert had done, but I could barely focus on his words. I was too busy trying to process the fact that every private moment I thought I had, every time I'd believed I was alone, Robert might have been watching me, recording me, documenting my life without my knowledge or consent. I asked the detective what they were planning to do about it, what criminal charges they were going to file, and she told me that they were still investigating, that they were going through all of the footage and the recordings to determine the full scope of his crimes. She said, "We found evidence of voyeurism, which is a felony in this state. We found evidence of surveillance and recording without consent, which is also a felony. And we found what appears to be stalking behavior, which could result in additional charges. Your husband is facing significant prison time for these offenses, assuming the evidence holds up in court." As I was absorbing this information, Detective Morrison said something that made me realize that the investigation was far from complete. She said, "We also found documentation in his apartment that suggests he may have been planning to harm someone, possibly himself, possibly someone else. We found detailed plans, timelines, and what appear to be instructions for creating a scenario that would have resulted in his death being ruled an accident." Can you think of any reason why he would have needed to create that kind of documentation? I looked at my lawyer, and he immediately said that I shouldn't answer any questions that might incriminate me or suggest that I'd been aware of Robert's plans. But I wasn't worried about incriminating myself. I was worried about what this meant for the already complicated situation we were dealing with. Over the next several days, as more details about Robert's case emerged, I realized that the situation was far more sinister than anyone had initially understood. The police had found not just voyeuristic recordings and surveillance equipment, but also a detailed notebook in which Robert had documented what he believed to be a conspiracy against him. He'd written about how Margaret was trying to steal his money, how Patricia was trying to isolate him from his children, how I was trying to make him look like a monster by divorcing him and taking his assets. Most disturbingly, he'd written about how he believed we were all working together to destroy him, that there was a coordinated effort among all of us to take everything he had and leave him with nothing. The police showed me pages and pages of his handwriting where he documented supposed interactions between me and Margaret, meetings that he claimed we'd had where we'd conspired to take his money and ruin his reputation. But the dates he'd written down didn't match reality at all. He documented meetings between me and Margaret that had occurred on dates when I hadn't even seen her, when I'd been somewhere else entirely, when he would have had no way of knowing where I actually was, because he hadn't been with me. It became clear that Robert hadn't just been documenting reality, he'd been creating an alternative narrative, a fictional version of events that existed only in his mind and in his journals. My lawyer explained that this was consistent with someone experiencing the delusional disorder, that Robert's belief in a conspiracy against him was so strong that he'd been creating false evidence to support that belief, that he'd been constructing an entire fictional reality in which he was the victim being persecuted by everyone around him. The detective said, "What we're looking at here is someone who has lost the ability to distinguish between what actually happened and what he imagined or what he fears might happen. He's documented conversations that never occurred, meetings that never existed except in his own mind." I called Margaret and told her what the police had found, and she said something that made me realize how deeply Robert's delusions had penetrated our lives. She said, "Do you remember last month when you called me and said you couldn't meet for lunch because you had a doctor's appointment?" I said, "Yes, I remembered that." Margaret said, "Well, Robert called me that same day and told me that he'd followed you and that you'd gone to meet with me instead of going to the doctor's office. He said you were conspiring with me to hide money or to plan how to take away his custody rights. I told him he was being paranoid and that he needed to get help, but now I'm realizing that he probably wasn't just being paranoid. He was literally creating false memories and false documentation of events that never actually occurred. The implication of that was staggering because it meant that Robert's delusions had progressed to the point where he wasn't just reinterpreting real events, he was completely fabricating fictional scenarios and then believing them so thoroughly that he was documenting them as if they were real. He'd taken his voyeuristic recordings and his surveillance equipment and he'd woven them into some kind of narrative that supported his paranoid beliefs about all of us conspiring against him. The police investigator explained that this pattern of behavior suggested Robert was experiencing what's called erotomania, a delusional disorder where someone becomes convinced that another person is in love with them or is part of their personal narrative in ways that aren't based in reality. But the troubling part was that Robert's erotomania seemed to have extended beyond romantic love and into some kind of persecution complex, where he believed that everyone in his life, including the people he was supposedly protecting with his surveillance, were actually working together to destroy him. It was a perfect storm of psychological pathology, a combination of narcissistic personality disorder, possible borderline personality traits, voyeuristic behavior, and what was starting to look like actual psychosis. The detective told me that a psychiatrist would need to evaluate Robert to determine whether he was competent to stand trial, whether his delusions were so severe that he shouldn't be held criminally responsible for his actions. I asked the detective whether the surveillance and the recordings would be admissible in court, whether Robert's conspiracy theories and his false documentation would be relevant to his legal defense. She said, "What's interesting about your case is that he's documented his own crimes. He's created a record of his surveillance activities, his recordings, his voyeuristic behavior, but he's also created a record of his delusional thinking, his paranoia, his false beliefs about what all of you were doing. So his defense might actually rest on arguing that he was so mentally ill that he didn't know what he was doing was wrong, that his delusions were so consuming that they prevent him from being held criminally responsible." As I was leaving the police station that day, I realized that Robert's crimes had been so thoroughly documented that there was almost no way he could deny them, but his mental illness might actually save him from the worst consequences. He might end up in a psychiatric facility rather than in prison, might spend his time being treated for his delusions rather than being incarcerated for his crimes. And while part of me thought that sounded like a better outcome than prison, another part of me felt cheated, felt like Robert was going to escape accountability for what he'd done by claiming insanity. But the detective told me something as I was leaving that made me reconsider that perspective. She said, "Mrs. Bookdua Patterson, I've been doing this job for 25 years, and in my experience, the worst prison anyone can end up in is their own mind. Your husband has created a reality so divorced from actual reality that he might never be able to live in the real world again. Even if we release him tomorrow, even if all charges are dropped, he's going to spend the rest of his life trapped in these delusions, unable to trust his own perceptions, unable to form genuine human connections, because he'll always believe that people are conspiring against him. In a way, that's a punishment far worse than anything the criminal justice system could impose." 2 weeks after my meeting with the police, I received a call from Robert's lawyer informing me that Robert had been admitted to a psychiatric facility for a 72-hour evaluation to determine whether he was competent to stand trial. Apparently, during his initial appearance in court, Robert had become increasingly agitated, had started ranting about the conspiracy against him, and had attempted to attack the prosecutor, claiming that the prosecutor was part of the group working to destroy him. He'd had to be physically restrained by bailiffs, and the judge had ordered an immediate psychological evaluation. Margaret called me as soon as she heard the news, and we agreed to meet for coffee to discuss what this meant for all of us. She said, "I don't know whether to feel relieved or terrified. On one hand, it's good that he's getting help, but on the other hand, I'm scared that he's going to get better and then come after us, that he's going to somehow turn everything around and make it seem like we're the ones who drove him to madness." I understood her fear because I felt the same way, but I also realized that Robert's mental breakdown might actually be the thing that finally gave us some closure, that finally freed us from the ongoing cycle of his manipulation and his lies. The psychiatric facility released an initial report that confirmed what the detective had suspected. Robert was experiencing a delusional disorder with persecurity features, and he was also exhibiting signs of what the psychiatrist called shared psychotic features, meaning that his delusions had become so consuming that he'd started to create a reality that only made sense within the context of those delusions. The psychiatrist wrote that Robert was not currently competent to stand trial, that he required ongoing psychiatric treatment and medication before he could be expected to understand the charges against him or assist in his own legal defense. This meant that instead of going to trial immediately, Robert would remain in the psychiatric facility while they attempted to stabilize him with medication and therapeutic intervention. The process could take months or even years, and there was no guarantee that he would ever become stable enough to stand trial. In the meantime, I would be in limbo, unable to fully move forward with my life, because there was still this open criminal case hanging over my head, still the knowledge that the man I'd been married to for 40 years was being held in a psychiatric facility because he'd become so unstable that he couldn't even participate in his own legal proceedings. I visited Robert in the psychiatric facility once, about a month after he'd been admitted, because I thought I owed it to myself and to him to try to understand what had happened to him. When I saw him in the visiting room, separated by a glass partition with a phone line connecting us, I barely recognized him. He looked smaller somehow, more fragile, like the years of maintaining his elaborate lies had been keeping him upright, and now that those lies had been exposed, he was literally collapsing under his own weight. I picked up the phone and said, "Hello, Robert," and he stared at me for a long moment before saying, "I don't think I know you anymore." I asked him what he meant, and he said, "I know you're my wife, or you were my wife, but I'm not sure anymore if our marriage was real or if it was part of the conspiracy. I'm not sure if you were ever really in love with me or if you were always working with the others to destroy me." I tried to explain that none of that was true, that the conspiracy he believed in was a delusion, but he looked at me with such conviction in his eyes that I realized he would never believe me, that his mind had become so consumed with these false beliefs that no amount of evidence or explanation would ever convince him otherwise. I asked him about the surveillance equipment, about the recordings he'd made, and he became defensive, insisting that he'd only done it to protect himself, to have proof that everything he was saying was true. He said, "If I could just show you the footage, you'd understand. You'd see what you were really doing, what you were really thinking. The cameras caught everything, and once you watch those recordings, you'll understand why I had to lie, why I had to create those other lies, why I had to protect myself from all of you." I realized in that moment that Robert had become completely detached from reality, that the delusions had consumed him so thoroughly that he genuinely believed that his surveillance equipment and his recordings were evidence of a real conspiracy rather than documentation of his own mental illness. I told Robert that I was leaving, that I couldn't continue this conversation because it was becoming clear that there was no version of Robert that I could reach, no part of him that was still connected to reality. As I was hanging up the phone to leave, Robert suddenly pressed his face against the glass and said something that haunted me for weeks afterward. He said, "I'm sorry for what I did to you, but I'm also not sorry because I had to do it to survive." I don't know how to explain what it's like to be me, to be trapped in a reality that only I can see, where everything and everyone is working against me. Maybe one day the medication will help me understand what's real and what's not. But right now, all I have is the truth as I see it. And in my truth, you're the villain in my story. Over the next year, I focused on rebuilding my life, on trying to move forward in a way that didn't require me to think about Robert or his mental illness or his crimes. The criminal charges against him were indefinitely postponed pending the outcome of his psychiatric treatment, which meant that there would be no closure through the legal system, no trial, where all of the evidence would be presented and the truth would finally be established in a court of law. Instead, I had to find my own way to closure, had to figure out how to forgive Robert for what he'd done without ever getting an apology that I could actually believe in or accept. I started seeing a therapist who specialized in trauma and betrayal, and we worked through the deep wounds that Robert's gaslighting and manipulation had left on my psyche. The therapist helped me understand that I wasn't responsible for Robert's mental illness, that I couldn't have prevented any of this by being a better wife or a more attentive partner. She helped me separate my own sense of reality from the false narrative that Robert had been trying to impose on me for 40 years, and slowly I began to reclaim my sense of self and my confidence in my own perception of the world. Margaret and Patricia and I remained in contact, and we eventually started meeting regularly with a therapist who specialized in group therapy for people who'd been victimized by the same perpetrator. These sessions were some of the most healing experiences of my life because it allowed me to process my trauma with two other women who understood exactly what I'd been through, who didn't need me to explain what it felt like to discover that the man you'd trusted with your entire life had been lying to you for decades. We shared our stories, we cried together, we laughed together, and slowly we began to move forward. One day, about a year into my recovery, Margaret said something that changed how I understood everything that had happened. She said, "I've been thinking about Robert a lot, and I've realized that in a weird way, this whole thing brought the three of us together. Without his betrayal, without his lies, we never would have met each other, and we never would have formed this incredible friendship. He tried to divide us, he tried to keep us separate, but instead he created the circumstance for the three of us to find each other and support each other." Patricia nodded and added, "And I think that's the best revenge against someone like Robert, isn't it? Not wanting him to suffer or go to prison, but actually finding healing and joy and friendship in the wreckage of what he created." I realized that they were right, that in some strange way, Robert's elaborate system of lies and deception had inadvertently created the opportunity for three women to find solidarity and support in each other. The three of us had become like sisters in a way that I'd never experienced with my own blood relatives, and we'd formed a bond that was stronger than anything Robert could have broken or destroyed. We decided to take a trip together, a women's retreat where we could celebrate our survival and our friendship, and it was during that trip that I finally felt like I could truly move forward with my life without constantly looking back. During our retreat, I also made the decision to change my will and my financial arrangements. I had inherited a substantial amount from Robert as part of the divorce settlement, and instead of keeping it all for myself, I decided to create a trust fund for all 6 of the children, the 2 from my marriage to Robert, as well as the 4 from his relationships with Margaret and Patricia. I wanted to make sure that Robert's children would have opportunities and support regardless of what happened to him, and I wanted to ensure that they would know that we, the 3 women he'd wronged, cared about their well-being, even though we'd been victimized by their father's behavior. My own children were surprised by this decision, and they questioned whether I was being too generous, whether I was letting Robert off the hook by taking care of his other children. But I explained to them that these children weren't responsible for their father's crimes, that they were victims of his deception just like we were, and that I couldn't in good conscience allow them to suffer because of choices their father had made. My son said something wise to me at that point. He said, "Mom, I think this is the moment where you finally become free. You're not carrying Robert's burden anymore. You're not trying to make sense of his actions. You're just being a good person in the face of his badness, and that's how you win." As I reflected on that conversation, I realized that my son was right. That freedom wasn't going to come from Robert ever being held accountable in the way I'd hoped. It was going to come from me choosing to live my life according to my own values, my own principles, my own sense of what was right and good, regardless of what Robert had done or who he'd pretended to be. And that realization, more than any legal victory or criminal conviction, finally gave me the closure I'd been searching for all along. About 18 months after Robert had been admitted to the psychiatric facility, I received a letter from him. It had been screened by the facility's mail department, and my lawyer reviewed it before giving it to me to make sure it didn't contain any threats or anything that would require further legal action. The letter was handwritten, in Robert's shaky handwriting, and it was surprisingly lucid and self-aware in a way that I didn't think he was capable of anymore. He wrote, "Dear Margaret, I'm not sure this is really you reading this. I'm not sure that anything I've written is real anymore. But my psychiatrist has encouraged me to try to communicate with the people I've hurt, to try to apologize, even if I'm not entirely sure what I'm apologizing for anymore." The letter continued, "The medication they have me on has helped me see some things more clearly, though I'm still not sure if what I'm seeing is reality or another variation of the delusions I've been experiencing. But I want to apologize to you for lying to you, for deceiving you, for stealing your time and your trust and your emotional energy. I want to apologize for the surveillance, for the recordings, for violating your privacy in ways that I don't think I fully understood the severity of until they were explained to me by the doctors here. I want to apologize for building a life with you that was based on a lie, for making you part of a fantasy that only existed in my mind." Robert went on to write about his childhood, about his father's abandonment, about the years he'd spent in therapy without ever really making progress because he'd been too afraid to be honest about the depths of his psychological problems. He wrote, "I think the real tragedy of my life is not that I betrayed 3 women or hurt 6 children or created this elaborate system of lies. The real tragedy is that I spent my entire adult life running from myself, running from my own pain, and in doing so I created pain for everyone around me. And now I'm trapped in this facility, on medication that makes me question whether anything I remember is real, unable to know if the remorse I'm feeling is genuine or just another delusion. And I'm not sure which option is worse." But then he wrote something that made me cry, something that suggested that maybe, just maybe, some part of Robert was actually reaching out, actually trying to take responsibility for what he'd done. He wrote, "If there's any part of you that can forgive me, not for my sake but for your own, so that you can fully move forward with your life, I want you to know that I've given you permission to do that. You don't owe me anything, not forgiveness, not understanding, not even the courtesy of reading this letter. But I want you to know that I recognize that I hurt you, that I lied to you, that I violated your trust in ways that can never be fully repaired, and I'm sorry. I'm genuinely sorry, and I mean that even though I'm not entirely sure I know what genuine means anymore. I sat with that letter for a long time, trying to determine whether Robert was being sincere, whether this was another layer of manipulation, whether his apology was real or just another performance. And I realized that it didn't matter, that I'd reached a point in my healing where Robert's sincerity or lack thereof no longer defined my experience of what had happened to me. I could accept the apology without needing it to be perfectly authentic. I could acknowledge his pain without allowing it to diminish my own. I could forgive him without needing him to change or understand the full impact of what he'd done. I wrote a response letter to Robert, something I never thought I would do. I wrote, "Dear Robert, I've read your letter, and I want to acknowledge that I believe some part of what you've written is genuine, even if I can't know for certain whether it's the real you speaking or another version of the lie. But I'm choosing to believe that there's some part of you that recognizes the harm you've done, and I'm accepting that as enough. I'm choosing to move forward with my life, to build something new and meaningful without constantly looking back at what you did or who you were. I'm not forgiving you because I think you deserve it. I'm forgiving you because I deserve to be free." As I was sealing that letter to send back to Robert, I realized that I'd finally reached the point where I could let go of him completely, where I could stop defining myself in relation to his betrayal and start defining myself according to my own values and my own life. The pain of what he'd done would always be part of my story anymore. I had Margaret and Patricia, I had my children, I had my own life ahead of me, and I was finally ready to fully embrace that future without the weight of Robert's lies holding me back. 2 years after Robert had been admitted to the psychiatric facility, I received a phone call from his psychiatrist that I absolutely wasn't expecting. Dr. Morrison, who had been working with Robert on his treatment plan, said that Robert had made significant progress on his medication regimen and that his delusions had substantially diminished. More importantly, she said that Robert had requested to meet with me, that he wanted to apologize in person, and that she believed this meeting could be therapeutic for both of us if I was willing to participate. I told her I would think about it, and I hung up the phone feeling conflicted about whether I had the emotional capacity to sit across from Robert again and listen to whatever he wanted to say. I called Margaret and Patricia immediately, and we discussed whether I should agree to meet with Robert. Margaret said, "I think you should do it, but only if you're doing it for yourself, not for him. Don't go because you think he deserves another chance to apologize. Go because you need to hear him say these things face to face so that you can finally close this chapter." Patricia added, "And take someone with you. Don't go alone. Either take Margaret or your lawyer or both, but don't put yourself in a position where you're vulnerable and unprotected." I decided to bring my lawyer with me, and I scheduled the meeting for a month later, giving myself time to prepare emotionally for what might happen. When I arrived at the psychiatric facility with my lawyer, I was nervous in a way that I hadn't been since the initial confrontation at the coffee shop years earlier. But as I was being led to the meeting room, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me, because I realized that I had nothing left to lose, that Robert had already taken everything he could possibly take from me, and whatever he was about to say couldn't hurt me any worse than what I'd already experienced. When Robert walked into the room, I was shocked by how much he'd changed. He looked older, more fragile, but also more present, more grounded in reality than he'd seemed the last time I'd seen him. Robert sat down across from me and didn't speak for a long moment, just looked at me like he was trying to memorize my face, or perhaps trying to convince himself that I was real. Then he said, "I want to apologize for everything I've done to you, and I want to do it in a way that's actually meaningful, not just words that I'm saying because my therapist told me I should. I've spent the last 2 years in this facility trying to understand why I did the things I did, trying to separate what was real in my mind from what was delusion, and I've come to understand that a lot of what I believed about you, about Margaret, about Patricia, was fundamentally untrue." He continued, his voice steady and clear. "I created a narrative in my mind where I was the victim, where all 3 of you were conspiring against me, where I was justified in lying to you and deceiving you because I believed you were all trying to destroy me. But the medication has helped me see that narrative for what it is, a fiction that I created to justify my own behavior, a way of avoiding responsibility for the choices I made. And I want you to know that I understand now that none of that was real, that my delusions about your betrayal were projections of my own guilt and my own shame." Robert pulled out a thick folder and said, "I've written a detailed account of everything I did, everything I lied about, every way that I manipulated you. My therapist has advised me not to give this to you, has advised me that it might be re-traumatizing for you to read all of the details of my deception. But I wanted you to have it, because I think you deserve to know exactly what happened, to have a complete record of the truth as I understand it now." He slid the folder across the table, and I could see my lawyer tense, could see him preparing to advise me not to take it, but I reached out and took it anyway. Then Robert said something that completely changed my understanding of the entire situation. He said, "There's something else I need to tell you, something that my therapist helped me remember through a series of therapeutic sessions, something about our marriage that I've been repressing for decades, something that I think played a significant role in why I did the things I did." My heart started racing, because I had a feeling that whatever he was about to say would be the final piece of the puzzle, the thing that would finally explain everything that had happened. He took a deep breath and said, "I think I always knew that you didn't really love me, not in the way I needed to be loved. And I think I've always known that I didn't really love you either, not in a healthy way. I think our marriage was doomed from the beginning, and instead of facing that reality, I created these other lives as a way of escaping from the truth." Robert's words hung in the air between us like a physical thing, and I realized that he was saying something I'd suspected for a long time but had never been brave enough to voice out loud. He said, "I want to tell you about the very first affair, about Margaret, and I want to explain it in a way that might help you understand not just what I did, but why I did it, and what it says about our marriage." He paused, and when he continued, his voice was almost a whisper. Margaret came into my life at a moment when I was absolutely desperate for someone to see me, to actually know who I was beneath all the lies I'd been telling myself and everyone around me. And when she looked at me, I felt like maybe I could finally be myself, could finally be honest about who I really was. I listened as Robert explained that meeting Margaret hadn't been a random encounter. It had been deliberate, that he'd been looking for an escape route from our marriage for years before he found her. He said, "I think on some level I was hoping that you would find out, that you would catch me, that you would demand that I be honest with you. And when you didn't catch me, when year after year went by and you never discovered the truth, I think I started to resent you for that. Because it felt like you didn't care enough about me to notice that I was living a lie." This revelation struck me like a punch, because it suggested that I hadn't just been betrayed by Robert, I'd been betrayed by my own lack of attention, my own willingness to accept his explanations and move on without really investigating whether what he was telling me was true. But then Robert said something that pulled me back from that spiral of self-blame. He said, "But that's not your fault. That's not something you should feel guilty about. I deliberately made it impossible for you to see the truth. I gaslit you, I manipulated you, I created a situation where you couldn't trust your own instincts. So I don't want you to take responsibility for my choice to betray you, even if I was hoping on some level that you would discover it." Robert then revealed something that shocked me even more than the confession about the affair. He said, "The real reason I wanted to meet with you today is because I'm being released from this facility. My therapist and the review board have determined that I'm stable enough to be released into outpatient care, and I wanted you to know about it before it happened. I wanted you to have time to process that, to take whatever precautions you feel necessary, and to know that I'm no longer a danger to anyone, including myself." My lawyer immediately started asking questions about the terms of his release, about whether there would be any restrictions on his behavior, about what protections were in place to prevent him from contacting the three of us without permission. Robert said, "I've agreed to remain in weekly psychiatric treatment, I've agreed to continue taking medication, and I've agreed not to contact any of you directly without prior permission from my therapist. There's also a restraining order in place that prevents me from coming within 500 yards of any of your homes or places of work. But I wanted to tell you in person because I didn't want you to find out through some other source and feel blindsided. I felt my stomach drop as I realized that Robert was about to be released back into society, that he would be out there somewhere in the world, living his own life while I would have to spend the rest of my life knowing that he was out there. But then Robert said something that made me reconsider my fear. He said, "I want you to know that I've decided to move away, to start a completely fresh life somewhere new where no one knows who I am or what I've done. I'm going to live alone. I'm not going to pursue any relationships. I'm going to focus entirely on maintaining my mental health and on rebuilding myself as a better person. And I'm going to do this not because I think I deserve a fresh start, but because I think you and Margaret and Patricia deserve to be able to move forward with your lives without constantly wondering if you're going to run into me at the grocery store or the bank." I asked Robert where he was planning to go, and he said, "I'm moving to the Pacific Northwest, to a small town where I don't know anyone and where I can just disappear into a quiet life. I've arranged for my remaining assets to be placed in a trust that will continue to support our children and Margaret's children through college and beyond it. And I've made arrangements for my therapist to send you quarterly reports on my progress, so you know that I'm maintaining my treatment and staying stable." As I was processing this information, Robert looked directly at me and said, "I know that this doesn't fix anything. I know that it doesn't undo the pain I've caused, but I hope that it's something. I hope that knowing I'm going to be far away, living a quiet life, trying to become a better person, is enough of a consequence for what I've done." After Robert was released from the psychiatric facility and moved to the Pacific Northwest, my life took on a new rhythm and a new peace that I hadn't experienced in decades. The constant uncertainty about what he was doing, where he was, what he might be planning, was finally gone, replaced by a sense of closure that felt almost like grief. I'd spent 40 years married to Robert, and even though that marriage had been built on lies and deception, there was still a part of me that mourned the loss of it, that mourned the person I thought I'd been married to, even though that person had never really existed. I spent my 70s doing things I'd never had time to do when I was married. I traveled with Margaret and Patricia. We went to Europe together, we went to South America, we went to Southeast Asia, and we had the kind of adventures that I'd always dreamed of but never thought I'd be able to afford or have the freedom to pursue. The three of us became known among our friends as the Musketeers, and our friendship became one of the great joys of my life. We talk about Robert sometimes, about the strange turn of events that had brought us together. But mostly, we talked about our own lives, our own dreams, our own futures. I started a support group for women who'd been victimized by serial cheaters and chronic liars, and I was surprised to discover that there were dozens of women in my community who had experienced something similar to what I'd gone through. Some of their stories were even worse than mine, involving physical abuse in addition to emotional betrayal, and I felt grateful that while Robert had hurt me profoundly, at least he hadn't hurt me physically. Through this support group, I found a renewed sense of purpose. I found a way to transform my pain into something meaningful by helping other women process their own trauma and move forward with their lives. My children eventually came to terms with their father's mental illness and his crimes, though it took years for them to fully process the betrayal of discovering that the man they'd called Dad for their entire lives was someone completely different from who they thought he was. My son actually went into psychology partly because of what he'd witnessed with his father, and he specializes in personality disorders and the psychology of deception. My daughter became an advocate for people in psychiatric facilities, working to ensure that patients' rights were protected and that people with mental illness were treated with dignity and respect. One day, about 5 years after Robert's release from the psychiatric facility, I received a letter from him. It had been forwarded through his therapist, and it was one of the last pieces of communication I would ever receive from him. He wrote, "Dear Margaret, I'm writing to tell you that I've decided to stop receiving therapy. My therapist and I have discussed this at length, and we've determined that I've reached a point in my recovery where continuing treatment would be more about maintaining dependency on the therapeutic relationship than about actual healing. I'm doing well here in the Pacific Northwest. I have a quiet job. I live alone. I volunteer at a local animal shelter. And I've made peace with the fact that I will never be able to repair the damage I caused to you, to Margaret, to Patricia, to our children." He continued, "I want you to know that I think about what I did every single day, and I probably will for the rest of my life. But I've learned that carrying guilt and shame is different from learning from your mistakes, and I want to spend whatever time I have left on this earth learning and growing, rather than just punishing myself. I've also started writing, documenting my experiences with mental illness and deception, and I'm hoping that someday my story might help other people understand that mental illness is not an excuse for hurting people, but it is an explanation for why people sometimes hurt others. If you ever feel safe enough to read my writing, I think it might help you understand me better, not in a way that excuses my behavior, but in a way that explains it." The letter ended with, "I want to thank you for being the person you are, for choosing to forgive me even when you had every right not to, for finding friendship and solidarity with Margaret and Patricia, instead of allowing my betrayal to divide you further. That is the greatest consequence of my actions, not punishment, but the knowledge that even in the wreckage I created, something beautiful and meaningful emerged. I'm proud of you, Margaret, and I'm sorry that it took me 40 years and a complete mental breakdown to tell you that. I held that letter for a long time, and I decided that I would read Robert's writing if he ever published it. Not because I thought it would change my understanding of what he'd done, but because I thought it might help other people understand the psychology of deception and the connection between trauma and betrayal. I realized that Robert's journey, as painful as it had been for all of us, had ultimately taught me something valuable about human nature, about the capacity for people to hurt each other, and about the remarkable resilience of the human spirit. 7 years after Robert's release from the psychiatric facility, I was surprised to receive a phone call from Patricia. She said, "I need to meet with you and Margaret, and I need to tell you something about Robert that I think you should know." When we met at our usual coffee shop, Patricia revealed that she'd been in contact with Robert's therapist, who had informed her that Robert was dying. He'd been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, and he had maybe 6 months left to live. Patricia said Robert's therapist reached out to me because Robert had asked her to contact one of us, and she wasn't sure which one, so she contacted Patricia, who had the most current contact information. Margaret and I were shocked and saddened by this news, even though we'd spent years trying to move on from Robert and his impact on our lives. There was something about the knowledge that he was dying that brought back all of the complicated emotions we'd been sitting with for the past 7 years. Margaret said, "Do you think we should reach out to him? Do you think we should try to see him before he dies?" I said, "I think we should give ourselves permission to make that choice for ourselves individually, not as a group, not based on what we think we owe him or what we think is the right thing to do." Margaret decided that she wanted to visit Robert, that she wanted to have a final conversation with him and try to achieve some sense of closure. I decided to write him a letter instead, and Patricia decided to send him her regards, but not to visit in person. When Margaret returned from her visit, she seemed lighter somehow, more at peace. She said, "He's really sick, and he's really dying, and he knows it. And he spent our entire visit apologizing and thanking me for being the strong, intelligent woman that I am. He said that the greatest regret of his life was that he'd hurt me, that given the chance to do it over again, he would have been honest with me from the beginning, would have told me that he was already married, would have let me decide whether I wanted to be part of that situation." Margaret continued, "And he told me something that I think you should know. He said that his greatest fear in life is being forgotten, is dying without anyone remembering that he existed. And that's when I realized that despite everything he did, despite all of the pain he caused, he's still just a human being at his core. Still just someone who wanted to be loved and remembered and validated." I listened to Margaret's account of her visit, and I felt my own heart soften slightly toward Robert, not in a way that erased what he'd done, but in a way that acknowledged his humanity alongside his crimes. I never did visit Robert in person before he died, but I did send him a final letter. I wrote, "Dear Robert, I've heard that you're dying, and I want you to know that I don't hate you anymore. I want you to know that while what you did to me was wrong, while you hurt me profoundly and took away years of my life, I found a way to move forward that doesn't require me to carry anger or resentment toward you anymore. I want you to know that you'll be remembered, not as the man you pretended to be, but as a cautionary tale about what happens when people refuse to deal with their own pain, when they run from their problems instead of facing them head on." I continued, "I want you to know that the greatest gift you gave me unintentionally was the friendship of Margaret and Patricia. Those 2 women are my sisters now in every way that matters, and we've built a life together that's full of joy and meaning and authentic connection. That's your legacy, Robert, not the lies or the betrayal, but the unlikely friendship that emerged from the wreckage of what you created. I hope that brings you some peace as you face the end of your life." I never received a response to that letter, but I didn't expect to. I thought it was enough that I'd said what needed to be said, that I'd offered him the grace of my forgiveness, even though he'd never fully earned it. Robert died on a quiet Tuesday morning in March, 6 months after his diagnosis, exactly as his doctors had predicted. I was at home when I received the phone call from his therapist informing me of his death. I felt a strange mixture of emotions that I couldn't quite name. Sadness mixed with relief, grief mixed with gratitude that this chapter of my life was finally completely closed. The therapist told me that Robert had left instructions for his memorial service, and he wanted Margaret, Patricia, and I to be notified, though he didn't ever expect us to attend. We did attend, the three of us together, sitting in the back of a small community church, where maybe 30 people had gathered to remember a man who'd spent most of his life lying to everyone around him. There were a few distant relatives, some friends he'd made in the small Pacific Northwest town where he'd moved, and his therapist who gave a brief tribute to Robert's struggle with mental illness and his genuine effort to become a better person in the years before his death. I listened to people talk about how kind Robert had been at the animal shelter, how quiet and thoughtful he'd been as a neighbor, how no one in that community had any idea about his past, about the lives he'd destroyed, about the betrayal and deception that had defined most of his adult life. As I was listening to these tributes, I realized something important. Robert's past, as terrible as it had been, was his past. He'd spent the last years of his life trying to become a different person, trying to atone for what he'd done, trying to live a quiet, honest life in a way that he'd never been able to do before. And while his atonement couldn't undo the pain he'd caused, while his change couldn't go back and erase the decades of lies and manipulation, I thought it was important to acknowledge that he'd tried. That in his final years, he'd made a genuine effort to become better. After the service, I went back to my house, the house I'd lived in for 40 years with Robert. The house I'd fought so hard to keep during the divorce. I looked around at the rooms that had been part of my marriage, and I felt a sense of peace and closure wash over me. This house was no longer a symbol of betrayal or lies. It was simply a house, a place where I'd lived my life, where I'd laughed and cried and loved and been hurt, where I'd learned who I really was beneath the false narrative that Robert had tried to impose on me. I called Margaret and Patricia and suggested that we take one final trip together to celebrate not just our survival, but the lives we'd built in the aftermath of Robert's destruction. We went back to Italy, where we'd been 5 years earlier, and we stayed in a beautiful villa overlooking the Amalfi Coast. We drank wine, and we talked about Robert, about the strange journey that had brought us together, about the unexpected gift of friendship that had emerged from betrayal and pain. And as we were watching the sunset on our final night of the trip, Margaret said something that perfectly captured what I'd learned through all of this. She said, "You know what I think the most important thing is? It's not that Robert hurt us. It's not that he lied to us. It's not even that we found each other because of him. The most important thing is that we chose to move forward anyway, that we chose to build something meaningful from the wreckage, that we chose to love and trust and be vulnerable with each other, even after being so profoundly hurt by someone we thought we could trust." Patricia added, "And I think that's what I want to be remembered for, not the pain I experienced, but the strength I found within myself to move past that pain and create a life worth living." As I looked out at that Italian sunset, surrounded by the 2 women who had become my sisters, who had walked through this nightmare with me and emerged on the other side stronger and more resilient, I realized that I'd finally found the closure I'd been searching for all along. It wasn't in Robert's apology, it wasn't in his punishment, it wasn't in his death, it was in my own choice to move forward, to forgive, to love, to build a life that was full of meaning and purpose and authentic human connection. I'd spent 40 years married to a man who was fundamentally incapable of being honest with me, and I'd spent the years after that learning to be completely honest with myself. I spent my final years surrounded by the people who truly loved me, who saw me clearly and completely, who didn't need me to be anything other than exactly who I was. My children, who'd overcome their own trauma and betrayal to become beautiful, compassionate human beings, were a source of constant joy and pride. My grandchildren, who would never know the full story of what their grandfather had done, would grow up in a family marked not by deception and lies, but by the values of honesty, integrity, and genuine human connection. And Margaret and Patricia, my sisters in every way that mattered, remained by my side through every moment of my remaining years. When I looked back on my life, I didn't regret the 40 years I'd spent married to Robert, because even though they were built on lies, they were still years I'd lived, still years that had shaped me into the person I eventually became. I regretted only that it had taken so long for me to see the truth, that it had taken a betrayal of such magnitude for me to fully understand who I really was. But I was grateful, deeply grateful, that I'd survived it, that I'd emerged from that darkness into a life filled with light, with authentic human connection. The story of my marriage to Robert became not a cautionary tale about the dangers of trusting too much, but a testament to the human capacity for resilience, for forgiveness, for finding meaning even in the darkest circumstances. It became a story about how 3 women who should have been enemies became sisters, how betrayal can paradoxically bring people together, how the worst thing that ever happened to you can ultimately become the catalyst for the best thing you ever create. And that, I think, is the truest ending to this story, not with Robert's punishment or death, but with the knowledge that I'd found a way to transform my pain into purpose, my grief into growth, my betrayal into the greatest gift of my life. The end.